Your 401k lost ground in 2022. You probably blamed inflation. You were right, but only about the symptom. The cause was a decision made in a building most Americans couldn't locate on a map, executed with a precision that economists are only now beginning to forensically reconstruct. What follows is not commentary. It is a documented sequence of events. Pay attention. On March 16, 2022, the Federal Reserve raised the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. It was the first of what would become 11 consecutive rate hikes over 18 months. The most aggressive monetary tightening cycle since Paul Volcker put a 20% rate on the American economy in 1980 and deliberately induced a recession to kill double-digit inflation. What the public narrative buried was this: the internal strategic framework guiding the 2022 cycle bore a structural resemblance to a classified IMF operational playbook drafted in 1979. A playbook designed not merely to control domestic inflation, but to recalibrate global capital flows in a manner that would concentrate liquidity inside developed nation financial systems. The mechanism was elegant and brutal. Raise the cost of dollar-denominated debt. Watch capital flee the periphery. Watch the center hold. The periphery in this case was the developing world. In the 12 months following the Fed's initial March 2022 hike, Sri Lanka defaulted. Pakistan entered IMF emergency negotiations. Egypt's pound lost 50% of its value. Ghana defaulted on its external debt in December 2022, its first default in a generation. Zambia, already in default since 2020, watched its restructuring timeline collapse. Argentina's parallel exchange rate hit a 100% premium over the official rate. The IMF's own data logged over 50 nations simultaneously in debt distress, a figure not seen since the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. Economists at the Bank for International Settlements began using internal shorthand for what they were observing: a sequential, low-visibility collapse moving through the emerging market architecture, like a slow detonation through a connected system. They called it a cascade. The term that later entered academic literature was blunter: the quiet cascade. Here is what made it quiet. Unlike the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which had a single visible ignition point, the Thai baht devaluation on July 2nd, the 2022 cascade had no single photogenic moment of collapse. It was geographically dispersed and temporally staggered. Each default appeared, in the media cycle, as a local story: a Pakistani fiscal crisis, a Ghanaian debt restructuring, a Sri Lankan president fleeing the country via airport at 2 a.m. Each was reported in isolation. None was reported as a system. That is not an accident of journalism. That is a function of how economic statecraft operates when it is working as designed. The signal is most effective when it cannot be distinguished from noise. Now, bridge the Atlantic. Here is where your financial position enters this briefing. When developing nations default on dollar-denominated debt, the immediate pressure absorber is not Wall Street. It is the IMF and the World Bank, both of which are capitalized significantly by U.S. Treasury contributions. Between 2022 and 2024, IMF emergency lending commitments exceeded $200 billion. That is a number that roots directly through sovereign financing mechanisms that influence the yield environment for U.S. Treasuries. When the U.S. underwrites global financial stabilization at scale, the marginal cost of that underwriting does not disappear. It redistributes. It shows up in long-duration bond yields. It shows up in the 30-year fixed mortgage rate that was sitting at 3.1% in January 2022 and had crossed 7% by October of the same year. If you attempted to refinance your home in the second half of 2022, or if you are among the cohort of Americans priced out of home ownership since that inflection point, you have a direct material connection to the quiet cascade. The mechanism is obscured. The consequence is not. But the mortgage rate transmission is only the first-order effect. The second-order effect operates through commodity and energy supply chains. When a nation like Ghana or Zambia enters debt distress, it does not simply stop paying creditors. It stops investing in productive infrastructure. Mining operations face capital withdrawal. Agricultural supply chains degrade. Port logistics contracts get deferred or cancelled. Ghana is the world's second-largest cocoa producer. Zambia sits on one of the largest copper reserves on the planet. Copper that is now a strategic material, not merely an industrial one, because it is the primary conductor in the EV supply chain, in grid-scale battery storage, and in the defense electronics manufacturing that the Pentagon's 2024 Rearmament Acceleration Directive explicitly identified as a national security dependency. When Zambia's fiscal architecture destabilizes, the forward pricing of copper shifts. When copper forward pricing shifts, the cost of building an American EV battery plant shifts. When that cost shifts, the capital allocation calculus of every domestic manufacturer in the electrification supply chain shifts. The boardroom decision that follows eventually reaches your job market. This is not a theoretical pathway. This is traceable economic telemetry with documented decision nodes at every stage. There is a third vector that the standard financial commentary almost never reaches, because it requires integrating geospatial analysis with monetary policy, a discipline that exists almost exclusively inside government analytical shops and the research desks of the top 4 sovereign wealth funds. When capital exits the periphery during a dollar tightening cycle, it does not exit into a vacuum. It exits into an opportunity. China's Belt and Road debt-for-equity restructuring operations moved with notable velocity in the 2022 to 2024 period, precisely because distressed nations had fewer alternatives. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka had already become the reference case study. A Chinese state entity acquiring a 99-year lease on strategic maritime infrastructure after Sri Lanka's debt became unserviceable. Following the 2022 quiet cascade, analogous restructuring negotiations were logged in at least 8 additional nations across Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The strategic depth implication is direct. The United States does not need to lose a single military engagement to watch its geopolitical operating environment contract. It simply needs to allow the debt distress cycle to run its course while a competing economic power operates with patient, long-horizon capital. The infrastructure that gets acquired in a debt default is not rebuilt in a budget cycle. It is rebuilt in a generation, if it is rebuilt at all. Now return to the 1979 playbook. The declassified IMF internal documents from that era, available through the IMF archives with a research access request, describe a framework called adjustment with external financing conditionality. The operational logic: when global inflation required monetary tightening in developed economies, the resulting capital flow reversal in developing nations could be managed through conditioned lending, structural adjustment requirements, and phased liberalization of trade accounts. What the 1979 framework did not fully model was the geopolitical auction that occurs in the gap between a nation entering distress and a multilateral institution completing its bureaucratic response. In 1979, that gap was filled primarily by Western bank syndicates. In 2022, that gap was also filled by a state capitalist competitor with $3.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves and a 40-year infrastructure investment strategy. The playbook was the same. The table had different players. The Federal Reserve's mandate, by statute, is domestic price stability and maximum employment. It is not required to model the second and third-order geopolitical consequences of its rate decisions on the developing world. That analytical function belongs to the National Security Council's Economic Directorate, the Treasury's Office of International Affairs, and the intelligence community's Economic Threat Assessment Division. Whether that function was fully exercised in 2022 is a question that the public record doesn't yet answer. The classified record, based on the pattern of outcomes, suggests the answer is complicated. What you have been given in this briefing is the documented architecture of a single causal chain, from a rate decision in Washington, through a cascade of sovereign defaults across 4 continents, through the commodity and bond yield transmission mechanisms, to your mortgage payment, your job market, and the strategic infrastructure map that will define American geopolitical leverage for the next 2 decades. The general consensus is that 2022 was a rough year for markets. That framing is accurate the same way describing a chess match as a rough game of pieces is accurate. You now have the board. Most people are still watching the clock.